All right, I'm going to kick us off today because we have a lot to get through in a short hour. But thank you for joining us for our webinar focused on offshore wind decision making. We're really excited about this. We have a great panel. And I'm just going to start by going over a few webinar logistics. Could you go to the next slide, Emily? So today we are going to be posting and recording the webinar to the NREL YouTube channel and the WINDExchange website. This webinar is hosted by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and the DOE WINDExchange initiative. And we want to thank them for their generous funding of this webinar series. This is a webinar in a series of both technical and social topics. And we'll get into that a little bit more later as well. We're going to have a panel and a question and answer following the initial presentation. We ask if you could please pose your questions in the Q&A feature. The chat just gets a little bit overwhelming. So if you could put your questions there, that'd be great. And we'll be compiling them for the end of the Q&A. Next slide. So what we're going to be covering, we're going to do a quick introduction to offshore wind energy. So you don't need a background to get what you need out of this webinar. We'll be doing a quick summation. And then we're going to be going over offshore wind energy development at the federal, state, and local level. So looking at it across jurisdictions. And then we have a fantastic panel with representatives from the state, local, and federal level. And with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker who's going to be doing kind of our overview session, Suzanne McDonald. So Suzanne is joined NREL this summer, and she's a senior researcher supporting our stakeholder engagement and energy equity initiatives. Prior to the lab, she was the Chief Community Development Officer at the Island Institute and has been working in coastal community capacity building and other community-focused work for the last 9 years in the New England region. She currently sits on advisory committee for the state of Maine's offshore wind roadmap and holds degrees from Tufts and McGill. So with that, I will pass it off to you, Suzanne. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz, and welcome for those of you just joining. We're going to jump right in. There's a lot to cover today, and we're really pleased that you were able to make the time to join us. I think this is a really great foundational opportunity for all of us to have a conversation about one of the most important pieces of the offshore wind development process, which is getting input from those who have an interest in the future of that industry. We're really pleased with the stellar panel that we've assembled today. We've got great perspectives at the federal, state, and local levels to help us piece it together, which is something that I think is really important. As Liz said, I've spent more than a decade working with coastal and fishing communities in New England on the topic of offshore wind. And I know from experience that the decision-making process can sometimes be challenging to understand, particularly as there are so many different players and timelines and, of course, acronyms involved in this work. But our hope is that today's discussion will give you at least a general sense of the different spaces where decision-making is occurring around offshore wind, how they potentially intersect or play off of each other as well. And we hope that you leave feeling a bit more confident in how to follow along with these processes and provide meaningful input in the weeks and months ahead. But to get us started, we'd love to just kick things off with a poll so that we can get a little bit of a better understanding to what extent some of you maybe have engaged in offshore wind decision-making processes already. So Emily, if you could launch our first poll. You can see the question is, how have you engaged? If you have engaged, and you can select more than one option if you'd like. We'll give that a couple of seconds for folks to respond, and we'll see how familiar folks maybe are with this so far. All right, maybe 5 more seconds. Give it a little bit more here. Emily, when you see the activity start to slow down a little, if you wouldn't mind sharing the results, that would be great.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. This looks like a lot of you have had some degree of experience with it. Tracking, at least, seems to be the area that has the most experience, folks reading about it, following along. And some of you have actually had a chance to attend some meetings. It's great. We've got a lower number who have actually submitted comments, and a similar number to folks who are out there helping stakeholders to submit comments. So it's really great to see people are starting to dip their toes in the water on this. But welcome to those of you who have not participated in the process. We're quite happy to have you as things get going. Thanks. So why don't we move to the next slide and just back up for a moment. So as Liz said, we promised to give you a little bit of context here if this is new, as I know it is for some of you. So why are we talking about offshore wind? There are many reasons why the US government and the wind industry are pursuing development off of our shores. First of all, is the fact that the majority of our population in the US lives and uses energy along our coast. And so by siting energy generation close to where folks live, we can actually reduce some of the challenges of transmission or the ways in which we move energy to people. The winds offshore are actually stronger, more consistent, and less turbulent than on land because of the absence of buildings or other obstructions in the landscape. We have the opportunity to deploy larger scale turbines than on land and projects as a whole, in part because there aren't the same transportation constraints that we run into when trying to move very large wind turbine components across the land. The industry can also create really important economic benefits and workforce development opportunities, both along our coast, but also in the interior US. And we think that when this work is done intentionally and with a focus on equity and justice, that it can create opportunities for folks who have been historically burdened by the development of fossil fuels or otherwise marginalized in our society. Next. But right now in the US, we only have 42 megawatts of operating offshore wind across 2 different projects, as compared to more than 50 gigawatts and 257 projects globally. Block Island off the coast of Rhode Island is a 30 megawatt 6-turbine project that was actually developed on the edge of state waters and became operational back in 2016. And the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project is actually only 2 turbines at this stage. They were actually the first 2 turbines that were deployed in federal waters. It has been operating since 2020, about 27 miles offshore. And in both instances, these projects are actually, the turbines are fixed to the ocean floor using 2 different types of substructures that we can call a jacket and monopile structures. While we might not have that much that's operational at this moment, there is absolutely a pathway to seeing quite a bit more offshore wind off of the US. This slide shows close-ups of the regions where the federal government is currently looking to develop offshore wind, including all the major bodies of water in the US. The Atlantic, where there's been quite a bit of activity, the Pacific, and Gulf of Mexico, which is certainly newer in the Great Lakes. There's been some discussions and sort of things are starting to get going there as well. Next slide. But to try to accelerate this activity even further, in March of 21, the Biden administration set a target of installing 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. In order to reach this target, the administration made commitments to set milestones to increase the pace of lease sales and permitting in order to create well-paying and unionized jobs. They also made a commitment to provide port infrastructure development funding and expand financing options for developers and suppliers to help strengthen the domestic supply chain for offshore wind. And also, the federal government has made a commitment to support critical research and development and data sharing by bolstering the efforts of an initiative called the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium, or now RDC. Also by partnering with industry to fill ocean science data gaps and expanding studies on offshore wind impacts. Let's go to the next slide. So let's head into some more specifics of the decision-making process around how and where these projects are built, and importantly, how you might be able to help shape that outcome. Next slide. So whether you work on the water or live along the coast or call the interior of the US your home, there's a chance that you might have some sort of an interest in how offshore wind development is taking place. I will acknowledge the term stakeholder here. It's a tricky one. It's one that people are not always clear on or comfortable with because it does lack some specificity. Today, we may use the word stakeholder to refer to the focus of some of the public input opportunities within the regulatory decision-making process. I do really want to note, though, that Indigenous communities, regardless of how federal or state governments may recognize them, are not considered stakeholders. Indigenous peoples have deep and longstanding connection to the offshore environment and unique and important legal and cultural status that really requires additional and even different engagement from the stakeholder groups that we'll mostly be focusing on today. So I'm going to spend just a couple minutes going through three key areas or jurisdictions in the development process, the federal, state, and local levels, that just will give you like a basic introduction. And then I'm going to hand it over to our esteemed panelists to give, so they can give you some more details on their individual area of focus and along with some guidance on how you can best engage in those levels. Next slide, please. So we'll start off at the federal level. This is really where a lot of the activities are being initiated and coordinated and moved forward. It's really a tremendous effort to have seen this work sort of deepen and grow over the last decade or so. But the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, is the lead federal agency responsible for offshore wind in the US. BOEM is part of the US Department of Interior and works closely with other federal and state agencies to issue leases, easements, and right-of-ways for renewable energy projects, including offshore wind. Their focus is on federal waters and submerged lands on the outer continental shelf, which is essentially the waters that extend beyond state lines, which is typically about 3 nautical miles offshore in most areas. Unlike other energy sources, the federal government, BOEM, is leading the siting and planning processes for offshore wind. And as I said, over the past decade, BOEM has done a tremendous amount of work to build a really comprehensive yet streamlined and predictable multi-part process to cover both planning, leasing, site assessment, and the construction and operations phases, all of which have opportunities for stakeholder input. We're so fortunate to have Karen Baker, who's the chief of BOEM's Office of Renewable Energy Programs, here with us today to provide more detail on this process. I'm sure she'll plug the BOEM website, but I will plug it as well because there's just such a wealth of information, but also graphics that I think make it a lot easier to follow all of these different pieces of the process. Next slide. So this slide just goes over through some of the steps that BOEM goes through in order to both try to begin the process around siting offshore wind and actually leasing space in the ocean and getting projects up and operational. So I'm not going to go over this in great detail because, again, Karen is here with us, but seeing that, oftentimes there's an opportunity for BOEM, generally in partnership with states, to issue what's called a request for information. That is a good place to start with understanding the interests of various stakeholders around areas of the ocean. Then there's a lease and grant process that allows developers to actually get going on the development process of specific projects. Very importantly, there's a very comprehensive federal environmental review that, in coordination with a number of other agencies, we're able to get a better understanding of any environmental impacts and opportunities to address them, obviously human impacts as well. And then getting into the really detailed oversight of the planning process to understand exactly how projects could operate, what resource they're going to make use of, and everything from constructions into the operations phase. Next slide, please. And this is just going back to those buckets, those areas of focus that BOEM oversees. I just want to point out here the intergovernmental task force that BOEM leads with the states are a great opportunity for folks to get really state-specific information on BOEM's website and help you understand what's going on in your state in particular. This map has highlighted all of the states where BOEM is currently working, either to establish a new task force or to go through that project development sort of process. There's also has been the creation of a number of task forces within regions to help bring states together when there's an interest in a shared region. So just really great to see the sort of enhanced coordination and collaboration over time, and clarity for stakeholders on all of these spots where stakeholders can get involved. Next slide, please. We'll move over to the states. They absolutely have a role in all of this as well. As I just mentioned, in collaboration with BOEM, working through the task forces is one of the ways where the states have quite a bit of input and influence. But most states have authority over the waters up to 3 nautical miles from their coastline, whereas we talked about the outer continental shelf and federal jurisdiction lays beyond that. In some states, this does vary. It's up to 9 nautical miles. And as someone with a background in island communities, I'll note that inhabited offshore islands are considered as part of a state's coastline. So for example, state waters here in some of the New England states can extend even beyond 20 miles from the mainland part of our coast. But so that gives quite a bit of area for states to be focused on. So in addition to working with BOEM through its process, there's a big role for states to play in determining consistency with state laws through the Coastal Zone Management Act. And the states may also play a role in permitting and siting some infrastructure like submarine export cables as they come across state waters or onto state lands. But beyond the permitting process, states can play a really integral role in setting the stage for offshore wind development. This can be done by establishing deployment goals. It's notable that as of mid-2022, 8 states have set offshore wind deployment goals that now total 39 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2040. States also can pass legislation or other directives to support development beyond the deployment targets, such as power procurement expectations. And states have the opportunity to invest in critical pieces of infrastructure like port facilities. I'll just add that states also are able to play a key role in coordination of stakeholders and investing in their interests and understanding of what's happening. Next slide, please. This is just a really quick example. Obviously, the state process is going to vary across the nation. This is an example of the more than decades worth of efforts in New Jersey, a state that has been continuously increasing their offshore wind deployment goals over the years and has issued 2 solicitations that were supported through other actions that the state has taken with the legislature and also through investing in ports. We're lucky to have Chris Ollis from the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind to be able to speak to us more about state process. And if you have questions on New Jersey, as a native and someone who's worked on offshore wind there, I think Chris will be able to answer any questions about New Jersey's trajectory. Next slide, please. So again, this varies widely across states and depending where they are in the process. We are looking forward to hearing from Chris, being able to share some of the themes and takeaways that she sees as she looks across the countries and some tips that she has for all of you if you're seeking to engage in the state process. But just to get you thinking, engagement at the state level can include participating in state-run processes or events. It could include joining task forces or working groups on offshore wind, depending on what the states are looking to bring to the table in terms of perspective. For example, in Maine, where I'm based, the Governor's Energy Office has been convening almost 100 stakeholders for the last year or two to help develop an offshore wind roadmap, and it has brought a number of local folks, whether they're town managers, fishermen, environmental groups, port managers, and folks from the wind industry to help be a part of creating a statewide vision for the industry. And also states obviously can play a big role in helping to get things going on the port side, on workforce programs. Those are topics that actually, as part of this series, we'll be covering in subsequent webinars. You'll have to keep an eye out, and Liz will give you some more information at the end of the webinar today about our upcoming webinars on the opportunities for stakeholder engagement in port development and other economic development and workforce efforts. Next slide, please. So the local role, I think this is a piece that is perhaps less understood at this moment, especially as more and more municipalities and communities are starting to track this issue as more proposals are being put forward and projects are moving along in the process where they can clarify things like where cables are coming ashore. So when we talk about the local role in the decision-making process, we're typically referring to any jurisdiction over activities that occur in what we call the upland areas, or the landward side of the mean high water mark. This is a little confusing, but we've got the high water mark up to the land, we've got the high water mark out to 3 miles is the state side, and federal beyond that. So this can have a real mix of both private and public ownership, depending on where you are, obviously. But municipalities, oftentimes with the input of local commissions or committees, may also need to approve cable landings, interconnections, or substations. Municipal leaders may also be invited to formally provide input into state and federal processes through participating in initiatives like the intergovernmental task forces. This is particularly the case if a municipality is likely to host or does host infrastructure of interest to the development of the sector, or perhaps they have another interest, like they're home to a robust fishing community and brings insights into that stakeholders group. We're really fortunate to have Jen McCann from Rhode Island Sea Grant here today to help us better understand this level of decision making, but I would just flag from previous experience that it can sometimes be challenging for local communities to come up to speed on the intricacies of a project and feel comfortable engaging in the development process. They may need help finding relevant expertise or simply hours in the day to help evaluate projects and understand what priorities or concerns they may have. The photo here of Block Island, it underscores not only that community's role in the cable coming ashore, but also so many other aspects of the Block Island wind farm and how the town of New Shoreham, which is the government on the island, was able to, I think, learn a lot along the way around how a local municipality can really get the resources, capacity, support it needs to really engage effectively and on behalf of the interests of its residents in the offshore wind development process. And again, we look forward to trying to share some of those insights as part of future webinars. Okay, next slide, please. So now that we've covered the 3 major areas of where decisions are being made, I just want to step back for a moment. We sort of take this for granted, right? Of course, this is good public engagement, right? So why are we focusing on public engagement opportunities and equity in the decision-making process? Well, first of all, it's required in many parts of the process. Public consultation, including scoping sessions, comment periods, public hearings are all a part of statute and required by the agencies reviewing these processes. So we have to do it. But I think we've all, or many folks, I think, have learned, perhaps the hard way, that the ultimate success of a project is oftentimes based in effective engagement with a diverse set of stakeholders. It allows decision makers and project proponents to develop a more complete understanding of a proposed development. I think by listening and learning, it creates an opportunity to de-risk a project and perhaps reduce opposition by identifying areas of potential conflict right up front and ideally finding appropriate ways to address it as soon as possible. By contrast, I think sometimes we see in offshore wind or in other industries that insufficient public engagement can oftentimes result in costly delays or projects even being stopped. And I think that what many of us in government, industry, even at the community level, are trying to learn more about now and get better at, I think, is understanding the concept of procedural and distributive equity in this process. So procedural equity of asking the question of who's at the table and has access to the table. What are we doing to make sure that those affected are able to help shape the outcomes? And then distributive equity, the idea that we're being really thoughtful about the distribution of impacts and benefits of a particular offshore wind project, and really thinking about those who maybe have been historically marginalized or impacted, particularly by fossil fuel based energy generation or extraction. This is an opportunity for us to not just ideally come to more acceptable and just outcomes, but really create even broader benefits than maybe were even considered at the outset of a project being created. Next slide. But all of this, as we've been sort of pointing to, isn't always easy. There's a lot to keep in mind as we're trying to track these processes. There are multiple jurisdictions and decision makers and individual projects, and increasingly we're seeing multiple projects unfold within the same region or state. And there may be stakeholders who are interested in needing to track multiple things at once. As I said, a tremendous amount of work has been done to streamline the process at both the federal and state levels, but the timeline to develop offshore wind can take many years. In some cases, folks have been tracking this for a decade or more. It's hard because I think on the local level, as some of the review takes place and the projects maybe slip away from the headlines, it can feel like things are quiet for a bit, and then all of a sudden an important milestone comes up again. And it's important to be able to track this over an extended period of time. And lastly, I think the terminology and technology might be new to some stakeholders. The language itself can sometimes feel intimidating or maybe exclusionary, and can change as technology evolves. There's obviously quite a bit that's happening as the technology develops around offshore wind, and in many cases, turbines are growing or upscaling over time, which can lead to changes in the proposed projects that are important for stakeholders and project proponents to be able to find constructive ways to talk about those changes. So all of that might be challenging if you represent a sector that doesn't typically track energy issues or infrastructure projects, or perhaps this isn't your professional work to engage in these processes, but I don't think that it's impossible. I've seen some really inspiring examples of people putting in the effort and really increasing their understanding about these processes over time. Stakeholders becoming conversant in the technology and citing enabling statute and mastering all of the acronyms, in fact. And I think there's a growing number of people working to make this process more accessible, including today's panel of experts. So let's transition on to our experts. I've asked them to build on this introduction to give you, if we want to move to the next slide, Emily, we want to just give them, allow folks to dig into these concepts a little bit more deeply into their area of jurisdiction. It's tough. In some ways, we're trying to create a discussion that's relevant nationally. So we're not going to do a deep dive into any particular state process, but rather look for some sort of rules of thumb, themes, tips across the board for folks to be able to track. So our first speaker is Karen Baker. If we go to the next slide, Emily, please. As you've heard, Karen is the chief of BOEM's Office of Renewable Energy Programs. She oversees the responsible development of renewable energy resources on the outer continental shelf through conscientious planning, stakeholder engagement, comprehensive environmental analysis, and technical review. Karen has more than 25 years combined of private industry and Department of Defense experience, and has had a number of leadership positions in strategic planning, energy and environmental policy, and public affairs. She has a diverse and deep academic background with the University of Maryland, Johns Hopkins University, and the National War College. So Karen, we'll hand it over to you to give us greater insight into the federal process.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, NREL, for the invitation and be here today. Glad to be here and very much appreciate that send up. If we go to the next slides, I think that this is, you set the scene well, and I'm probably going to touch upon many of these concepts again, but I think if you're learning this and people are wanting to understand more, maybe some repetition is a little bit helpful, but really do appreciate how well you set the scene and talked about the challenges and the and the opportunities and how we can engage our communities on this issue. So again, Karen Baker, I'm the chief of the Office of Renewable Energy Programs for BOEM. And BOEM is the lead regulator offshore wind on the U.S. Outer Continental Shelf. BOEM as a whole manages the development of offshore energy and mineral resources in an environmentally and socially responsible manner. I am charged with overseeing all of our efforts regarding renewable energy, and of course, with the administration emphasis, that means offshore wind. And so if I go to the next slide. Suzanne talked about this just a little bit, but this is our planning, really our leasing process from beginning to end in the various stages. There are 4 stages: the planning and analysis, leasing, site assessment, and construction and operations. And this is a very simplified chart that talks about a very complicated process, complex process, and something that can take some time. So to Suzanne's point, often we are working and engaging all the way through this process. Stakeholder engagement is really the cornerstone of all that we do, and there is an opportunity for public input in every aspect of what we do. But the challenge is because it is such a long term, going from planning and analysis to construction and operations can take up to about 5 years or so. From beginning to end, and it varies depending on the actual project. And so sometimes it is tough for people to understand where we are in the process, or also to understand where they can engage and the milestones and where they have had opportunity to get input. So let me just very briefly say in planning and analysis, this is really when we're starting to look at where we might see an opportunity for a region of opportunity on the outer continental shelf for development. We're using sound science. We are engaging with our partners at NOAA and others, and we are looking at and engaging with fishing communities and all areas of the public. There are public notices that are out that then that we then take into input in order to sort of scope those areas that we might want to avoid because of fishing interests or some other concerns from other communities. And so that's taken into account. We then move into leasing. We have auctions, and developers then will bid for that. What they actually receive, I saw some questions about leasing. At this point in time, what the lease guarantees is not that they can develop, but that they have the opportunity to survey and develop a plan, so they own the rights to do the surveys and develop a plan for construction and operation of a wind farm in that area. So they will do those site assessments, they will put together their plans, then they submit it to BOEM, and we review it along with a number of other cooperating agencies at the federal and the state level, and take this through the National Environmental Policy Act process, so an environmental impact statement in which we engage throughout that process. And eventually, once the plans are submitted and we have approved that, start to move to installation. So this is something where we take into account all along sound science. We have numerous opportunities throughout this process for engagement from communities. We are interested in talking to all ocean users, to communities that are impacted. We do our government to government engagements with tribes, and of course we're putting on information so that the public can engage and be part of this process. Next slide. This just gives you a broad overview of where we are right now in terms of the status of our projects. As Suzanne mentioned, the Atlantic coast is, we have a lot that's happening in this area. Important to point out, we have 2 that are actually working on construction, Vineyard Wind and South Fork. Everything else is a lease that is under some sort of a review in some sort of part of that other process. So we have 10 construction operation plans right now that are actually undergoing the review process. We expect about 17 more in terms of the leases that we have. And we are looking at other areas such as we just noted, had an announcement this last week that we will have a lease sale off for areas off the coast of California on December 6th. We are starting to look at area identification in Maine. We are looking at area identification in the Gulf of Mexico. Next slide. And I just spoke to some of this. These are the way forward in terms of where we're also looking other areas that were on that map. Go to the next slide. This gives you an understanding of the construction and operation plan timeline on the Atlantic, which is really the most robust and the most mature in terms of the portfolios that we have of leases at this point in time. What I think is key to note to this is that we believe with these leases, if they all move forward as planned, and of course, some of the plans, the developers will make business decisions. Some of them, again, we're moving through the permitting process. By the NEPA process, we can't preclude certain outcomes, but we're predicting that right now, as all things go according to plan, we're at about 27 megawatts towards that 2030 goal, 30 by 30 goal. At the end of this process. But as we mentioned, we have other areas we're looking at leases, and there are other that we expect to be coming forward. What's important to you too in this slide as you look at this is when we look at these where you see those orange dots, those are where we're talking about records of decisions that are coming new in the NEPA process. And you can see the significant amount that are coming in FY23, calendar year 23. And for that, we are already working on a plan where you will start to see notices of availability, public registers. My team is starting to put forward the plans for how we will do public comment periods, when we will have public hearings. We're doing a tremendous amount virtually right now, but we've also looked for opportunities to engage, especially make sure that we are doing the best that we can and looking at disadvantaged communities. We are talking to certain communities that are very much impacted, like fisheries, and of course coastal communities we're talking to all the time in terms of how we can best make sure that we balance all of the interests of stakeholders in an economically, environmentally, and socially justified way. So if we can move to the next slide. So that's just a brief overview. Most important, I want you to know how you can contact us. Suzanne, thanks for the shout out about the website. I would encourage you to go to the website, and if you go to the Renewable Energy tab, you can look at project by project on anything in your area. There's actually a map that will give you that information. But most importantly, you've circled on that. I've circled there on that on this slide that in red, that little envelope icon. If you're like me and you need a little help sometimes trying to find some things on the website, we want to make sure you can go and find this. And if you click on that, you can be added to one of multiple mailing lists that BOEM puts out. And so we can then, if you fill this form out and it will pop up, and if you populate that for us and submit it back to us, you will get our notice to stakeholders on any area of interest of yours. And so that's a great opportunity, a way for BOEM to be able to talk to you directly and share information about things that are happening in your area. So I'll stop there and we'll hand it back over to Suzanne, and we can take on any questions you have during the Q&A session.
Excellent. Thank you, Karen. Great tip. I hope that, we're not supposed to support multitasking, but if you want to go and sign up right now while you're thinking of it, I do think that is a really great tip in terms of how to track this. And again, those state pages are really helpful and up-to-date information. So thank you, Karen. Let's move on to Chris Olith. If we can go to the next slide, please, Emily. Chris, I'm so thrilled to have her here. I feel like Chris could have sat in on any one of these topics. Chris could have facilitated it. She could have done the local piece. Chris has such a diverse set of experiences in the offshore wind realm, and so I appreciate her stepping in with her state perspective on today. But Chris has been at this for almost 20 years, since offshore wind was really just being talked about, holding senior positions with offshore wind developers, NGOs, state agencies, done ocean planning work, really every angle of the industry Chris has had experience in. And I think it's been great to see her in her recent role as the director of the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind to be able to really take this broad perspective and invest in projects to support the responsible and sustainable development of the offshore wind industry. So as I mentioned, Chris is holding it down in New Jersey, has background degrees from Rutgers and University of Rhode Island, and lives there in New Jersey with her husband and retired racing greyhound. So Chris, why don't you take it away for us?
Thanks, Suzanne, and thanks so much for inviting me to be a part of this bit of a mutual admiration society. So excited to see Suzanne in her new-ish role now at NREL, and I know you'll bring such a world of experience to NREL's work. So it's just such great news to hear you there. I don't have slides today. I really want to just vamp for a few minutes on some of the key themes and thoughts that I have around the way state decision-making relates to offshore wind and how critical it is. And I think such an interesting and accessible opportunity for so many of us and a way to find, really a way to find a real effective and sweet spot. I mean, Suzanne asked me to think about some of the themes that I think about when I think about participating at a state-based level. And for me, while the local participation is key, and certainly the federal government plays such a role, I really see in the state process a combination of a relative amount of resources and capacity versus sometimes what we see at a local level. And then also really that good connection to stakeholders that sometimes maybe on the other end of the spectrum, the federal agencies may not have, because they're not necessarily in that localized, relatively localized scenario. So I think state agencies have this kind of sweet spot, the Goldilocks, if you will, where there's an opportunity to have direct contact and input with the state agencies, with those local stakeholders, and then also have a reasonable amount of resources available to them, where sometimes at the local level, you just won't find that level of capacity that, Suzanne was alluding to earlier. I also think that the states are in an excellent position when we think of the key challenges to offshore wind, and I'll list out a couple of them now. One, key challenge being opportunity to inject into a grid through a transmission system, right? If you think about the way that our grids have been built, if you think about the East Coast in particular, typically it's been built from west to east, with those power plants, if you can think of it being like the heartbeat of a transmission system. And by the time you get all the way out to the coastal areas, those are the little capillaries. And by that point, you have essentially the least robust part of a interconnection system. And now we're asking 30 gigawatts of offshore wind to interconnect into that relatively fragile system. And so states really are playing a huge role along with their regional transmission operators to figure out solutions for local injections. And why are the states doing this anyway? Well, we've seen over the past 2 decades, since offshore wind has been a thing here in the United States, that the states are driving, because they're the ones who have the renewable portfolio standards. They're the ones who have to meet the electricity and reliability needs of their local customers. And as we see the evolution of our grid, we see the greening of our grid across our country, which we do indeed see happening. We see the change where fossil fuel power plants are coming offline, nuclear power plants are coming offline, and the demand for electricity. We're electrifying our vehicles, we're electrifying our buildings, particularly in the New York, New Jersey area. And we meanwhile are seeing traditional power sources coming offline. And so my thought is always, if not offshore wind, then what? Then what can service these population centers, as we heard about earlier in the presentation? I did see a couple questions already coming through in the Q&A that I thought would make sense to proactively answer, that also align with one of the themes I was thinking about, and that is digging deeper into that why question, but why certain states have taken leadership in offshore wind. Why do we see some states further along in their processes? Well, typically there are 3 criteria that are looked at when citing offshore wind development. We call it the trifecta of offshore wind siting. And that, as you may imagine, first is having really strong and robust wind speeds. The second is having a strong population center or demand for injecting power. And the third is having relatively, middle of the road or higher electricity prices. Because to date, we have seen offshore wind, while prices are falling, being slightly above margin due to the fact that it's a new technology, one that a supply chain needs to be developed for. Our most recent study out of the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind does show that for the Delmarva Peninsula, for example, new offshore wind would be at parity with fossil fuel generated power. So that's an exciting development. But meanwhile, typically, if you're seeing super low cost of energy like that generated by fossil fuels in some states, because we don't really capture all the societal and economic costs of our generation supply. So you're seeing like the actual cost on the electricity bill low, though the societal costs are high, which aren't always captured right in that number. We see that offshore wind has been slightly above market. So typically it's been a target to look at states that have those higher electricity costs. So those are the three reasons that offshore wind, for example, has been really targeted in the Mid-East, the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast up until now. In addition, we really have that gently sloping shelf where monopile technology that is founded and very well used in Europe to date. I mean, over 10,000 turbines have been fixed to our seafloor around the world using monopiles at this time. So we know that is a tried and true testing technology. And once we move into that floating realm, other states will be unlocked. I really have a ton of other notes and I would love to share so much more with you, but I also want to hear from our colleague Jen McCann and take your questions. So I think, Suzanne, it makes sense probably for me to turn it over at this time.
I appreciate that. It's tough in an hour to get through all of this. And I will plug Chris's website. Maybe Chris, you could put it in the chat. The Special Initiative website has some really great resources that are, some of them are state specific and quite helpful to take a look at as well. So thank you, Chris. We will move on to Jen McCann, who's the director of the U.S. Coastal Program at URI and the Rhode Island Sea Grant. Because of her leadership in citing the Block Island Wind Farm through the Ocean Stamp process, the special area management planning process that happened more than a decade ago, Jen has a wealth of information and experience when it comes to offshore wind, particularly at the local level, which is part of why she's serving as the National Sea Grant Offshore Wind Energy Liaison to help build the Sea Grant's capacity on this topic. A really cool and great investment to be able to see. Jen leads research and provides technical support on blue economy related topics to government decision makers, the private sector, and the public, both locally and abroad. And we are just really pleased to have Jen here to help us understand the local decision-making process and the issues related to that. So Jen, take it away, please.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for this opportunity. And we'll just go to the next slide. And Suzanne, I really appreciated your presentation. And hopefully I'm not going to repeat anything you said because you did such a great job with that. So my focus for this 6 minutes is to talk about how can communities meaningfully engage in the offshore wind energy process. And you know, I always seem to think the word influence the process is really important. And so I'm going to give sort of 3 examples of what I've seen happen as far as how communities have engaged. And you know, I'm going to be talking a little bit about from municipalities to potentially resource users, coastal communities, like potentially fishing communities. So again, I don't have much time, so I'm happy to answer discussions. And you know, Chris gave good examples, you know, and the fact that, you know, again, your state is likely has a renewable energy goal and a commitment to promote offshore wind energy. So for local communities, you need to recognize that there's already a commitment to push offshore wind energy in your state. And that's a reality. And again, that's not to say you can't influence the process and or benefit from it. So here's an example that took place in Rhode Island in 2018, 2019, where communities did have significant influence in citing a preferred cable route for within Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island for the Revolution Wind cable. And this was led by the Coastal Resources Management Council here in Rhode Island, so our coastal program. And they invited, with support from Sea Grant and URI, a diversity of stakeholders, from the aquaculture industry to the fishing community to the Navy, to identify and better understand where are people using and how are people using Narragansett Bay, and how can we lay a cable that has the least amount of impact on existing resource activities, and also you know, on the natural resources. So this was a successful process, again, where the state played a leadership role to create an advisory role, an informal advisory role for all stakeholders. And it was also an opportunity for all of these stakeholders to come together to learn about this process together from researchers and other experts at the table, and not sort of speak with individual voices, but with a joint voice on and understanding people's issues. So again, the point of this story is that this happened even before there was any sort of formal submittal by Ørsted for Revolution Wind as far as a cable. So this learning and building of stakeholder capacity and also bringing that local knowledge came very early, even before the formal process started. Next, please. So another just quick example for New England. So this is a regional example where, and again, I believe Suzanne mentioned that, you know, a lot of times this has a regional context to it. So obviously Mayflower Wind is also looking for locations to land their cable. This is the Rhode Island. There is a potential, you know, they're going to land a cable likely in Massachusetts. There's also a proposal to, you know, again, go up Narragansett Bay, which is in the Sakonnet River part of Narragansett Bay, up through a community called the town of Portsmouth, and then up to Massachusetts to Brayton Point. And the way that, you know, I see that there's sort of three categories of local involvement here that are taking place. So you have organizations like the nonprofit Save the Bay and, you know, the Rhode Island Saltwater Anglers Association. And although, you know, the way they're choosing to influence the process is to write letters and to participate and voice their concerns and opportunities through that formal process, which Suzanne brought up. And that's the way that, again, the formal process is the way that they're sort of being required to engage. We are, however, our team, however, is doing quite a bit of informal education and also communication between different stakeholders and building that capacity in partnership with these two organizations to, again, hopefully mimic some of the successes that we had with the other example I provided. So in this same case, you know, in Rhode Island, it's the Energy Facility Siting Board, which is the state entity which is leading this process. And they are requesting that two municipalities that could potentially have economic impacts from the construction activities, that they provide formal comments, but just on economic impacts. That's all they want to hear. And again, this is an advisory aspect. So this is the formal aspect of it. And then the town of Portsmouth, which is here in the larger map example, because they're considered a host town where the cable will be going really specifically through their community, they are being also asked to provide formal processes. So the way the communities are engaging in this is definitely in the formal process, but our team is in particular trying to create informal opportunities where, again, organizations like the Saltwater Anglers and these municipalities could potentially, again, build their understanding and knowledge about what's happening and what potential effects are, so that there's more informal conversations, so decisions can be altered or enhanced before the formal process is taking place. Next slide, please. This is obviously the South Fork scenario here. And just wanted to mention that, you know, in some cases, community benefit agreements or host community agreements are created. This is the example in East Hampton, where a $29 million wind farm benefits package was agreed upon between the developer, Ørsted, and this municipality. So in exchange for the easements that allowed Ørsted to develop this proposed project. So this was an opportunity where, again, as Suzanne mentioned, this is the landward side where municipalities do have opportunities to potentially benefit from this development if they have the capacity and the forward thinking of preparing to appropriately negotiate. So next slide. Thank you. So how can communities meaningfully engage in the process? You know, here's some examples. I do know that in some of the agreements, so for example, in California's preliminary site notification, there's specific mention that, you know, a bidder could get a 5% bidding credit if they commit to developing a general community benefits agreement. And this also, something similar was mentioned with the Vineyard Wind project in Massachusetts. So there's opportunities for communities to ensure that this kind of language is in the formal documentation so that community benefits opportunities are developed throughout the formal process. So some of our tips is, you know, and hopefully I've illustrated this, is to, again, create opportunities to learn, for all stakeholders to learn together. You're stronger, united, and again, look for effects, but also opportunities. And there's no, you can't do that soon enough. Time to do it now, you know. Again, learn from others and work together. So I know in Rhode Island, since we had the first wind farm, we've had people from all around the country come and look at how did we do this siting process for the Block Island wind farm. We encourage you to do that with others in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New York, to learn from our successes and mistakes. You know, we mentioned the BOEM task force. Get to know the members and talk to them informally so that potentially your message can get into that conversation. You know, we were also mentioned this is a long-term activity. If you can secure a full-time community liaison, you know, who helps and shapes this community benefits package and answers community questions and concerns. And, you know, again, I'll say a plug, each coastal program has a Sea Grant program who is very, you know, different capacities for each Sea Grant program, or universities. There's a real opportunity for you to get support potentially from your Sea Grant program and or other departments within your university. So use them, they're there for you. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Jen. Yeah, the emphasis on the informal, right? This is about building relationships and shared understanding, to collaborative problem solving. This is all relationship driven, and creating those spaces is so important. So we packed ourselves quite full here and are running out of time. The beauty of Zoom registration is that by using the Q&A function, we can follow up with you for questions that we weren't able to answer in the Q&A function. So if we can answer it, we will reach out to you over email. To wrap up, I just want to pass it back over to Liz. We do have one question for you all to think about as you're making your way out of the webinar today. But just thank you to our three tremendous panelists. And yes, we will continue to have this dialogue with you all. So Liz, hand it over to you. I am not seeing Liz show up, so just in the interest of time here, Liz is having some technical difficulties. Emily, could you launch our last poll for us? What we want to understand from all of you is, how can the National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL, and the Department of Energy be helpful to you in this stakeholder discussion? it would help us if you could just take a look at this and see what types of informational resources would be helpful to you all. I know there was a question of, will there be a stakeholder group? I think peer-to-peer connections is something that I've seen be incredibly powerful in my work. And I think we're having discussions about how we could support some of those connections between and within regions. So please take a moment to fill that out. While you're doing that, as I said, there will be 2 more webinars in this series. And so for those of you who asked for follow-up, absolutely, we're going to look beyond the regulatory process and look at the stakeholder opportunities in port development and other economic development opportunities, and also relationships with developers, getting more into some of the community impacts. So please stay tuned to the WINDExchange newsletter and all of our comms to find out when that is going to take place. And again, check out the websites from our presenters today. The WINDExchange website from our team has a ton of resources within each region as well. And with that, let's take a quick peek at the results. Case studies of how other folks are getting through this, right? I think that's always really important. And topic-specific overviews is so you can really relate to the interests and regions that are most important to you. So thank you so much for this feedback. Thank you again to the presenters and to the Department of Energy for supporting us to come together. I hope you have a wonderful day.